Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to our next Sawtooth webinar entitled Predictive Segmentation with our own Keith Chrzan, Senior Vice President of Sawtooth Analytics, our consulting team. You may or may not know him, but he's a great guy, and we're going to introduce him in a second. Would like to announce some upcoming events for us. Our next webinar, we're trying to have a webinar once a month. Our next webinar is coming right up, July 11th. This is entitled Using ChatGPT as a Co-Pilot to Explore Research Data, given by Ray Pointer. He's an amazing presenter out of the UK. I would not miss this webinar. You can go to our website, sawtoothsoftware.com/webinars, to see our upcoming webinars, and all of our past webinars are on demand, free of charge. You can watch all of our past webinars, lots of good ones in our library there. Then coming up, end of July, July 22nd through 23rd, we're having a training event here in Utah. This is where we're based. We'd love you to come out to Utah for this training event. We're going to be talking about and training on conjoint, CBC, max diff, and adaptive conjoint, ACBC. We are also going to have a course on market simulations and a market segmentation bootcamp. You can learn more by going to sawtoothsoftware.com/workshops. Also, if you don't know much about Sawtooth software, we'd encourage you to check out our amazing platforms. We are really good at conjoint analysis and max diff, and just good at research software in general. We try to make it easy to use, and we think the best customer support in the industry. And you'll get a taste of that by listening to Keith today, and kind of the quality of people that we have. You can try us out for free at discover.sawtoothsoftware.com and check out our tool. With that, I'm going to turn the time over to Keith and have him share his screen.
All right. Thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. Let me share my screen here. We should have, there we go. You can see my presentation, yes?
Yeah, great.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I'll take it away then. So we're going to talk about predictive segmentation today. So by way of background, just to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page, I want to talk about what segmentation is and some different kinds of segmentation, and give an overview of how I think about the segmentation process and the steps we go through, kind of a flow chart of segmentation. And that's going to allow me to talk about predictive segmentation, where it fits in terms of different kinds of segmentations and where it fits in the segmentation process, because the tweak that we're going to do to make predictive segmentation is going to happen at one particular stage in the segmentation process. So once we've done sort of that background work and got everybody, so we're all on the same page, I'm going to talk about how do we actually do predictive segmentation. I'm going to show some examples, and then we'll show a case study at the end. And then, as Justin mentioned, we'll do Q&A. So let's go ahead and start on this background section here. You're probably aware that segmentation is just the process of putting respondents into groups so that the respondents within a group are similar and the respondents in different groups are dissimilar. And they don't have to be respondents. They could be observations. They could be, we could do a segmentation of frogs if we wanted and classify different groups of frogs or whatever. But in marketing research, it's typically people that we're going to be grouping. You can think about it as kind of the middle ground between old-fashioned mass marketing, right? Where Henry Ford said a customer can have a car painted any color they want as long as it's black, right? So that's kind of one extreme, one size fits all sort of marketing. And the other extreme is everybody's an individual, everybody's completely different, and we're going to customize products to fit each individual customer. Segmentation is kind of in between that. It's saying that not everybody's alike, but but rather than think about each respondent as being an individual, we're going to think about groups of people who might have similar needs or preferences or thoughts or beliefs about the world. In some way, different groups of people that we might market to differently because they're different in some marketing relevant way. Okay. So the standard study flow for a segmentation study would work something like this. There might be a phase of qualitative research that would precede the segmentation, where we talk to some people and try to figure out the dimensions on which those people might differ that would be interesting for marketing purposes. Or maybe we already have a pretty good idea about that because we're established in the product category and we can move straight to the second step, writing the questionnaire. In the questionnaire, we want to ask the kind of questions that are going to be able to allow us to differentiate people. So we're going to want to ask discriminating questions that don't have a lot of response error in them. There's a whole science about writing questions for segmentation studies that we'll actually talk about at some length in the segmentation bootcamp this summer, but isn't really our topic today. Once we've written the questionnaire and collected data, we're going to create our segments. Once we've created those segments, we're going to profile them. We're going to look at all the other variables in our survey and everything else we know about those people to try to turn them into flesh and blood human beings so that we can really think about how best to market to them. We typically, with a segmentation, provide a typing tool to extend its shelf life so that in future studies, you can ask, 6 or 8 of these typing tool questions and decide what segment a new respondent is in, so that in future studies, you can apply your segmentation. And then I've got clients who, once they've done the segmentation study, if they really want to understand their customers better within each segment, they might do a second round of qualitative where they talk, let's do a group of just, segment 1 people and a segment, another focus group of just segment 2 people and so on, just to try to get a feel for fleshing those people out some more. Okay. There's different types of segmentation, and we're going to talk about a couple different ways of thinking about segmentation. The classic way that you might see if you Googled segmentation, they talk about different types of input variables. I think that's a pretty uninteresting way to think about segmentation, and so I'll rather talk about the different kinds of segmentation that are based on the types of analysis we run. Again, that uninteresting way I think of thinking about segmentation is to think about, well, is it going to be a geographic segmentation? Are we going to sort people by what area of the country they live in? Or maybe it's a socio-demographic segmentation where we're going to, segment people based on facts about their, demographic facts about their households or their level of education or their level of income. Or maybe we want to segment people on the basis of their behaviors because some people behave differently than other people. Or maybe we want to step back from behaviors a little bit and create segments of people who have different attitudes or beliefs about our product or the product category, because maybe it's those beliefs we need to change. The truth is, though, that we could use any of those 4 or any combination of those 4 for a segmentation. There's no reason that we couldn't put 3 socio-demographic variables and 8 behaviors and 10 attitudes and segment on that set of 21 variables. No reason at all we couldn't do that. There's nothing that means that, although you see this discussed all the time, if you Google segmentation, I believe this slide is just a little bit of nonsense. Because of that, it isn't so much, the only time I really think about variables much isn't what they're measuring, because I'm a little bit indifferent about what they're measuring as long as they're measuring the things that we think people differ on, but how we use them. So one of the ways we can use variables in a segmentation study is as basis variables. So these are the variables that we're actually going to input to the segmentation program so that it can spit out segments to us. And this can be any of the 4 types or any of the combination of the 4 types we saw a couple slides ago. The other half of the variables in the segmentation study, or the rest of the variables in a segmentation study, we call profiling variables. And these are the variables that are going to allow us, once we've created our segments from the basis variables, these profiling variables are going to allow us to better understand our segments, to characterize them, to say how they're alike and how they're different, and hopefully to make them into tangible types of people we can market to differently. So that's the role of the profiling variables. I think it's more useful to think about segmentations based on what kind of analysis we're going to be running. So there are things called supervised segmentations where we have a dependent variable that's basically the criterion that we use for splitting people into segments. And then there's unsupervised segmentations that don't have any such dependent variable. Supervised segmentation are typically tree-based models. There's regression trees when we want to predict segments that differ on the means on some metric variable. We have classification trees where we're going to create segments that have different distributions on some categorical variable. And recently, there's even model-based trees where we're going to come up with segments of people who have different coefficients in some multivariate model, like regression or logit. The result of a tree-based segmentation might look something like this. This is just from an old segmentation study I did back around 1990 for satellite TV. We were trying to find out what the variables were, what groups of people there were that would be the target market for a new product called satellite TV that was out at the time. And so the way this analysis works is it builds a tree. It repeatedly splits the sample. So the point I want to make about this isn't to go in depth about this kind of analysis, because it's not our topic today, but to point out that the fact that we keep splitting the sample in two again and again and again makes this a very sample size intensive methodology. We need to have at least 1,000 respondents or so to make this work. The other kind of segmentation, the kind that we much more often do, is what's called unsupervised segmentation. So we don't have any dependent variable, like in the tree here, we had the amount of money people were going to spend on satellite TV. We don't have any such dependent variable here. We've just got a bunch of variables, and we're looking for people who differ across across all of the basis variables that we put in our study. So there's distance-based models that we can use, like cluster analysis or cluster ensemble analysis. And there's model-based clusters, model-based programs we can use, things that do something called latent class analysis or mixture modeling. And there's a bunch of those to pick from. So here's how I think about the segmentation process. The first question I ask myself is, do I have a choice model, and do I want that choice model to be the way I'm going to segment people? Maybe I've done a conjoint or a max diff or something, and I want people who have different utilities in their max diff model. Well, if the answer to that question is yes, well, that's not today's topic. We can talk about it some other time. I want to talk about cases where we don't really have a choice model. Where it's just a survey with a bunch of variables in it that don't conform to any kind of conjoint or choice experiment. The next question I ask myself there is, do I have one of these dependent variables that would be something that I could use for a supervised segmentation? And if the answer is yes, then we're talking about supervised segmentation, and that's kind of not today's topic. Don't really want to, that's not where predictive segmentation is going to lead us. If the answer is no, then we're going to be talking about unsupervised or plain vanilla segmentation. The next step then would be something called variable selection. We've got to look at our questionnaire and decide which variables to use as our basis variables. Once we've done that, we're going to do our clustering or our latent class modeling. And then what happens after that is also not today's topic. Where we're specifically going to talk today is about this step right here, variable selection. Because when we're doing a predictive segmentation, we're going to be adding just one more step to that variable selection process. Okay, why do we need to do variable selection in segmentation? Well, there's 4 good reasons, any one of which I think is a sufficient reason for doing it. But when you look at them all together, you've got lots of reasons to do variable selection. And if you're not doing variable selection in your segmentation, you're opening yourself up to a world of hurt. So let's take these one at a time. Sample size, something called the cursive dimensionality, things called masking variables, and things called redundant variables. It turns out that the ability to find segments in data improves as our sample size increases. That's not a real surprise, right? I mean, if we've got one of our segments is kind of small and only has 8% of the sample, and we're only interviewing 50 people, that segment might only have 4 people in it. It might not even emerge in our analysis. We might not even find it. So we know we need more sample size than that. There's 2 recommendations in the literature that are fairly current. And I'll just use a numerical example. Let's say we had 20 basis variables. So D is going to indicate the number of basis variables, and it's 20. And we think we might have up to 5 segments. So up to 5 segments. So that's gonna be a variable we're going to call K. K equals 5 segments. So some authors named Key and Joe in 2009 suggested that our sample size should be at least 10 times D times K. So in our example, it's at least 10 times 5 times 20 is 1,000. And the more recent one, which I think was based on much better research, they did a very thorough job. They suggested that you should have 100 times as many observations, as much sample in your study as you have basis variables. So if we think we're going to have 20 basis variables, we should think about having a sample size of 2,000. You can see that with either one of those equations, D is part of the formula. D is the number of basis variables. So all else being equal, the more basis variables we have, the more respondents we're going to need. So sample size is one reason for wanting to limit the number of basis variables in our study. I mean, the analyses that we run, you could throw 100 variables in there, and if you only had 200 respondents, the analysis would run. It just wouldn't be a very good way. It wouldn't be a very effective way of finding your segments. But I think there's a misconception on the part of a lot of people that just because the software would work with what I would consider way too many variables, we can run it that way. And the truth is, if you want to do segmentation well, that's what you don't do. So that's reason number one for wanting to do variable selection. Another reason is called the curse of dimensionality, and that's basically if you think of having 2 variables in your data set, you could think about that as being on an XY axis, right? You could plot all of your points for the values of those 2 variables in just a 2-dimensional space. Unfortunately, as the number of those variables increases, the space keeps getting bigger and bigger. In fact, the space increases exponentially. So with just 2 with just 2 variables, the volume of space would get squared, but with 20 dimensions, it gets raised to the 20th power. And the trouble there is that we have this huge multivariate space that's mostly empty. What happens, and here's a great quote from a fellow named Yu who wrote this on the internet, too many dimensions causes every observation in your data set to appear about equidistant from all the others. If all the distances are approximately equal, then all the observations appear about equally alike or equally different, and we can't really do a good job of finding meaningful segments. I just think that's a really neat observation. And before I was aware of the curse of dimensionality, I had done a lot of studies, and I was just, I would throw a lot of variables in there, and then I would be surprised that I had all these rich variables to choose from, and my segments weren't very different. And this is why. I was shooting myself in the foot by including too many variables. So this is reason number 2 for wanting to do variable selection. Another reason that I became aware of a while back is that there are these things called masking variables. That's just the name of them. What they are in a segmentation study is they're variables that we include as our basis variables, but it turns out they're not related to the segment structure. These are things that the segments don't differ on. And when we put them in our analysis, they tend to water down the differences between our segments, and they make the real, actual, true segment structure harder to find. In other words, they mask the structure. They keep our analysis from seeing the structure that's there in the data. So this is a third extremely important reason to do variable selection, because you don't want masking variables as part of your basis variables, unless you're trying to make the job hard for yourself. If you're hoping, I hope the segmentation is going to be a real pain in the neck, here's a good way to make it one. Include masking variables. And then finally, and this one I found was odd. In fact, when my colleague Joseph White and I did a study for the Sawtooth Software Conference a couple of years ago, and when we first saw this, we thought it was an odd finding. And then as we did some more reading, we realized that, other people had realized it before us, and that's that if you've got basis variables that are highly correlated with one another, including them can actually make the cluster structure harder to find. And if you're used to thinking about things like factor analysis, that should be real counterintuitive to you, right? Because In a factor analysis, you want variables that are correlated with one another. That's what your factors are going to be built around. But it turns out that in the world of cluster analysis, that's exactly what you don't want. And so we'd like to get rid of these correlated variables as well. So how do we do this variable selection? There's a few different ways. There's sort of a stepwise manual approach we can talk about. There's some automatic variable selection methods that are available in R. You can just write a bit of code and it does variable selection for you. Or there's something called an unsupervised random forest that my friend Joe Retzer told me about a couple of years ago, and I started using it then, and I've just been more and more impressed with it because it's a really easy way to do variable selection. I really like it. So let's how do we do it? How do we do these things? Well, a stepwise variable selection, as I suggested, is a manual process. Maybe we do it right within our clustering or our latent class program. So we run a k-means cluster analysis, let's say, with 30 variables. We look at those 30 variables and we notice when we look at the F statistics that really 20 of the 30 variables have really high significant F statistics and 10 of them don't. So what we do is we drop those ones that don't have large significant F statistics, indicating that the segments are differing on them, indicating, of course, that they're masking variables. We drop the masking variables, repeat the analysis, and we might have to do that once or twice or 3 times until we get out all of the variables that aren't related to the cluster structure. It's a little bit of a manual process, but since it uses programs you're already used to using if you're doing segmentation, it's a pretty easy way to do it. The other way would be something called stepwise discriminant analysis. So basically now we cluster with our 30 variables, and now we've got a cluster membership variable that we can predict, right? So we run a discriminant analysis to predict that segment membership using our 30 basis variables, and we run it stepwise. And ordinarily, stepwise modeling is not a great thing to do, but in this case, it's kind of helpful because what it ends up with are just the variables that help us predict the segments. So now maybe we find that 20 of our 30 variables actually help us predict segment membership. We use just those 20 in our analysis, and those are our basis variables. Now we recluster using that new set of basis variables. What I like about this, even more than about the manual procedure up above, is using the stepwise discrim, it's getting rid of both masking variables that we know are bad because they're hiding the segment structure, but it's also helping us get rid of redundant variables because of the stepwise procedure, if you've got 2 redundant variables, A and B, once A is in the analysis, since the information from B is largely redundant, it's probably not going to enter the stepwise discrim as a significant predictor. So I kind of like that. That's a neat way of doing variable selection, I think, for segmentation studies. The second class of methods were things that are automatic variable selections. There's a couple good ones I've tried in R. One is called clustvar_cell, cluster variable selection. However, as a caveat, if you're using rating scale data, and someday we'll have a presentation where you talk about why you shouldn't be using rating scale data, but if you did, and it's entirely common that people do, I've noticed that this clustvar_cell method tends to give us very few basis variables to work with. It's overly aggressive in terms of getting redundancy sometimes, I think. So I might shy away with it in that case. The other one is something called var_cell LCM, variable selection for latent class modeling. The neat thing about this method is it works if you've got mixed scale data. So if you've got a mixture of basis variables, some of which are metric, like rating scales or counts or percents, and others of which are percentages, but others of which are categorical variables like marital status or level of education, say, or career, job title. So it's real handy because it allows mixed variables, but it only really removes masking variables, and it doesn't do a good job of eliminating redundant variables. So I checked out both of these methods. I played with them both. I think they can be helpful sometimes, but I'm not really sold on them. The one I actually end up doing a lot more is something called an unsupervised random forest. So if you're familiar with random forests, you're probably familiar with the supervised case of random forests, where we have some dependent variable we're trying to predict. And we're actually going to talk about that in a few minutes. So put that aside. And now I'm going to tell you about a different kind of random forest. It's called unsupervised. It's actually kind of a deceptive name because, as you're going to see in a minute, there is some supervision going on. Basically, we have our data set. Let's say we've got our 1,000 respondents and our 30 basis variables there. What the unsupervised random forest algorithm does is it makes a copy of that data set and stacks it. So you've got your original data set, and then stacked right underneath of it is this copied data set. But in the copied data set, it's going to randomly and independently sort each one of your columns of data. So the copied data set has the same marginal distributions on all the variables, but all the relationships between the variables are broken. Every bit of structure that was in that data is gone in the copied data set. Now the random forest algorithm slaps a code of 1, say, on the original data, a code of 2 on the copied data, the copied and all mixed up data. And what it does is it runs a random forest to try to predict, is this the original structured data, or is it the unstructured data? The idea is that it's going to identify for us the variables that contribute to the structure in the data. So one thing that gets output from this, or is an output you can ask for from this, is a proximity matrix. Or you can get a set of attribute importances that measure the strength of each variable's relationship with the structure in the data. If you ask for the proximity matrix, you can directly import that into some clustering methods like hierarchical clustering or partitioning around medoids, and generate segments based on just that proximity matrix itself, which is drawing heavily from the structure predicting variables. Alternatively, you can look at the importances that come out of the random forest and say, well, gee, the important variables are the ones that I'm going to use in my cluster analysis. I'm going to look at just the important ones, and I'm going to take those forward, and those are going to be my basis variables now. So maybe I had 30 to begin with, and 10 of them are more important than the other 20. I'm going to focus on these 10. And I really like this too, because because it also works when you've got a mix of metric and categorical variables that you've got as potential basis variables. As long as you tell random forest which ones are metric and which ones are categorical, it doesn't care much beyond that. It treats them appropriately, and everybody's on a nice level playing field. And just in case you want to run one of those unsupervised variables here's just a little bit of our code for you. The only difference here is in the equation down there, the RF equals random forest. We're not specifying a dependent variable. That's really the only thing you have to do. And the random forest program knows, this is the random forest program in R. The random forest program knows that if you don't list a dependent variable, you want to run an unsupervised segmentation, unsupervised random forest, and it does that for you. So that's kind of cool. So now we've talked about all the pieces, kind of how to think about segmentation analysis, how to think about the variables, how to think about the kinds of analysis, the steps, how we would do segment variable selection. And now I want to talk about where predictive segmentation fits in that. I think predictive segmentation solves a specific problem. And when I describe this problem to you, you might think it's an uncommon one. So we'd really like our segments to differ on some particular variable. Like, we're going to be bringing out a new product. I don't know, spam on a stick or whatever. So, and what we really would like to do is have segments that are relatively different with respect to their adoption to go out and, buy a truckload of spam on a stick. So this is kind of our quasi-dependent variable. We're not going to use it formally as a dependent variable in our segmentation, but we would like to see our segments differ on it. In fact, if we had enough sample size, we would just go ahead and do a supervised segmentation, have it be our dependent variable, and build one of those regression trees like I showed you earlier. But unfortunately, we have a problem today. We don't have enough sample for a supervised segmentation. We don't have 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000 respondents. We've got a couple hundred. And so when I say it that way, you wouldn't think that there's a lot of segments that this qualifies for, but a lot of my business is I do a lot of B2B studies. And in B2B studies, whether I'm talking to, CFOs of Fortune 500 companies or interventional cardiologists in Europe, the fact is those populations are very small. And when we sample from those populations, we end up with samples that are even smaller. So, you want to talk to interventional cardiologists in Europe, you're lucky to get a sample of 200 of them, right? If you want to talk to CIOs in the Fortune 500, you'll be lucky to get 100 of those. And so we're dealing in the B2B space, we're dealing with much, typically smaller sample sizes. And that makes the predictive segmentation problem, although it's maybe not common in consumer research, it's very common in B2B research. And to think of it, I've probably done a half a dozen of these predictive segmentation studies, even in consumer research, right? We're coming out with a new product. We want to know who we're going to sell it to. Let's do a predictive segmentation. So that's the solution to the specific problem. And all we're going to do is we're going to add an additional initial step in our variable selection process. What we're going to do is we're going to identify the variables that are related to our quasi-dependent variable. And we can do that a couple different ways. There's kind of the one at a time approach, right? I could use my dependent variable and look at correlations of all my potential variables with that dependent variable and pick the ones that are most highly correlated. And of course, my basis variables, my potential basis variables that aren't metric, I can't really do correlations with. I could do an analysis of variance there and see, and I could look at the p-values from my F statistics from my ANOVA to identify which categorical variables are most predictive of the quasi-dependent variable. That's a bit of work, but it's easy enough to do by hand, right? If you've got SPSS, or heck, even if you could do this in Excel, right? You could run correlations in ANOVA, even in Excel, I think. So that's it's a few steps. It takes a little bit of time, but it's not overly onerous. Even simpler, and my preference here is to run a supervised random forest. I told you we were going to talk about that later on, and here we are. We're going to use that quasi-dependent variable as our supervising variable, and we're going to look to see which of our potential basis variables are the most important predictors of that quasi-dependent variable. And for a random forest, it's nice because random forest, as long as you run enough trees, doesn't really matter that you might have a small sample size. In fact, it doesn't even matter that your sample size is larger than your number of potential variables. So I had a client about a couple months ago. They came to me with a sample of, I think, 225 respondents or thereabouts, and they had something over 315, 320 potential basis variables. And we were able to use this random forest method to get that down to a much, much more manageable number. Once we've done that, then we go ahead and continue with the variable selection steps, but only using the top predictors that come out of this analysis. So if you think about it, what we're going to do is we're first going to winnow down our set of potential basis variables to include only the ones that are predictive of the quasi-dependent variable. And that's going to really help us ensure that the segments that come out are going to be different with respect to that quasi-dependent variable. But that process by itself doesn't necessarily get rid of our masking variables and our redundant variables. So I think you still want to continue with your variable selection process, the ordinary variable selection process we would do anyway, even after you've culled the list with this predictive segmentation step. Here's the R code for one of those, for a supervised random forest. I like this bit of code here. And I'm just going to show you what's going to happen when we run. But it's going to turn the importances into percentages for me. So bear with me here. I'm going to open here's a little text document I've set up that has my program in it. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go into R and I'm going to run it. It's currently running a forest with 1,000 trees in it for me, which is nice because I didn't have a huge sample size to begin with. I included 31 potential basis variables. They were listed up there. Here's the importances that ordinarily, in the lower left here are the importances that ordinarily come out of random forest. But I don't find those easy to look at. It's easier for me to turn them all into percentages. Here they are as percentages. And there's a couple different ways of deciding which ones, because you can see these range from about 0 to about 8% in importance. There are some various ways of deciding which of these I want to, where I want to cut it and say these are the important ones and these ones aren't. A good rule of thumb that I followed, and I don't even remember where I hear it, but where I heard it, but once I heard it, it's like, well, that rule of thumb works pretty well, is to think about what the average importance would be if none of these things mattered. Well, that's easy. It's 100% divided by my 31 potential variables I've got here. And that's about 3.25% or thereabouts. So if I double that number, if I double that expected under the situation that they're all random and unrelated, if I double that, that expected value of 3.25% takes it up to 6.5%. If I make that my cutoff, and I look here, well, the variable called geography is above 6.5% importance. Well, we have to keep going down a ways before we find some more. But then variables 26, 27, well, 27 maybe, 28 and 29. Those are really the 4 or 5 variables we're going to want to come out with here and say those are really the variables that seem to be highly predictive of our quasi-dependent variable here. So that's how I would use that. Now we're going to go ahead and step back into PowerPoint here. Make the screen bigger. Sorry. So anyway, if you ever want to run supervised random forests, there's the last 3 blocks of code there are going to be the parts that turn those importances into percentages, just to make them easier to use. So, but you don't really need that. You could really survive with the top half of this code and be just fine. Okay, I mentioned there's a couple different ways. The rule of thumb I gave you is the second method below. If you've got k variables, just use as your cutoff a relative importance of 2 over k. Once you've turned them into relative importances or percentages. Obviously, so if we had 100 candidate variables, an average relative importance would be 1%. And so we would make 2% be our cutoff. That's kind of that's a rule of thumb that works real well for me. But sometimes I want to be a real stickler, and I say, oh, this isn't a rule of thumb sort of day for me. I'm going to be hardcore about it. What I might do is I might add some random variables to my data set. In fact, I may take a leaf from the book about the unsupervised segmentation there. I may just copy 20 of my variables over into 20 new columns, randomly sort each one of those 20 new columns to break all of their structure. So now I've got 20 new random variables that have the same kind of distributions as my real variables have, but I know I've broken all the structure. I know they should be randomly related to my quasi-dependent variable. Now I include those 20 in my random forest analysis, and I say, well, I want to only look at variables that score, higher than those random variables do, or than most of those random variables do, or than 95% of those random variables do. And I'm going to use that as my cutoff for my candidate variables. So that's the second, maybe more of a fastidious way of doing it. But in my experience, they both kind of work the same. So I haven't usually seen there be a big difference in the results I get between those two. So that's so I already did the demonstration of the supervised random forest. I had a data set with just under 700 respondents, a dependent variable or a quasi-dependent variable, and 31 potential basis variables that we were able to winnow down to just 5 or 6 with that supervised random forest analysis. So let's in the couple minutes here before we can go to questions, let me do a quick case study here. I've got a client who wants to segment potential B2B buyers of a new technology product called NOE into groups with differing levels of interest in NOE. The client doesn't want, they don't want to just look at the variable purchase intent for NOE and divide it into high, medium, and low, because they want their segments to differ in other interesting ways. And unfortunately, my client can only afford a sample size of 1,000 here because it's a B2B study and these are expensive respondents. So they can't really run a supervised segmentation like I might otherwise have suggested. So instead, we're going to run this predictive segmentation. Our questionnaire contains some attitudinal ratings about the product category and about the importance of product features, some behavioral questions that are mostly expressed as percents or numbers of hours spent on certain activities. We've got a handful of categorical sociodemographic variables. And then, of course, our quasi-dependent variable, the question about the respondent's likelihood to buy the NOE product. As a result, we ended up with a little over 200 basis variables, which is way too many for our sample size of 500. And so it's kind of pointing us to predictive segmentation. In this case, I used that supervised random forest analysis on the 200 plus potential basis variables, and we found 33 of them to be predictive of respondents' interest in NOE. And again, notice that we could have found the same information a little bit less efficiently by running 190 correlations and 200 ANOVA or 20 ANOVAs, right? That would have just taken us a little bit more time than it took us to run the random forest analysis. And then we didn't just stop there, because we knew that supervised random forest only really got rid of the variables that weren't predictive of interest in the product. We didn't get rid of all the masking variables, and we didn't get rid of the redundant variables. And so we ran we did some further analysis, and we found that about half of the variables, 15 of the 33, were really just masking variables. And so we gave them the heave-ho, and that left us with a remaining set of 18 variables upon which we ran latent class clustering. As a result, we ended up with 4 segments with very differing levels of interest in NOE. And as you'd expect, they didn't just differ with respect to those levels of interest in NOE. They differed as well on the 18 basis variables, because that's what, because they kind of had to. They were the basis variables, and we had screened out all the masking variables. And so the basis variables were all strongly related to segmentation, and they were mostly attitudes toward the product category and self-reports of behaviors. I think there might have been one categorical variable in there. And it turned out, luckily, that the segments were also very different on a lot of the profiling variables. So the marketing team had a lot to work with in terms of developing the segments personas. And then we were able to build a typing tool, and the client was able to do follow-up qualitative research with different focus groups or one-on-one interviews with members of each segment. I don't remember if they ended up doing groups or I think with this small of a population, they probably did IDIs. Anyway, that's really all I wanted to show today. I did want to put in a plug. Justin mentioned earlier about this summer training event we're going to have in Lehi, Utah. We're going to do a day-long marketing segmentation boot camp there, along with some other topics. There's a link you can click on and find out more about that event. So it's going to be, and again, the segmentation boot camp is a day-long class that's going to cover what we covered here and a whole lot of other stuff as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you, Keith. We appreciate your expertise. Keith's been presenting a lot recently, and really appreciate his efforts. Let me share my screen real quick. Just our next webinar, you should check it out, using ChatGPT as a co-pilot to explore research data by Ray Pointer. You can go to sawtoothsoftware.com/webinars. Keith just mentioned our summer training event, end of July, and you can get there easily if you just remember to go to sawtoothsoftware.com/workshops. You can learn more about that. Please check out our tools. Discover is easy to use and free. You can see that at discover.sawtoothsoftware.com. And with that, we are open to the Q&A section. Keith, I think you can see, if you go down there and look at that Q&A, you can
I can. Cool.
Yeah, maybe
okay.
you could read the question and then answer it. That would be great.
Sure. Why not use principal components analysis to reduce the number of variables? It's a classic idea. It was widely accepted in the 60s. But in the past 40 years, we just know that that's turns out it sounds like a good idea, and it's not. It's a really bad idea. So we'll get into the details of why that is in the boot camp this summer. And I know I've covered it in other webinars, but basically the goals of factor analysis and the goals of segmentation are entirely separate. So what I will say is the principal components analysis would help you identify redundant variables. And so perhaps it's potentially valuable there. Doesn't do anything about masking variables. It doesn't do, it doesn't in any way help you find the variables that are related to cluster structure. And in my experience, a lot of times when you run a factor analysis or a principal components analysis, you'll have cross-loading items, right? You'll have items that load on more than one factor. And they tend to get ignored in a principal components analysis because you're really only looking at the markers, the attributes that are kind of load at the top of attributes. and not on multiple attributes. And so a lot of times in doing principal components analysis, we would just drop the cross-loaders. And yet in segmentation analysis, very often those cross-loading variables are the most valuable ones for segmentation. So I think principal components is an outdated way of doing a bad job of segmentation. So sorry if I trashed that idea, but okay, let's go on to the next one. How low the sample could realistically be with this method? There's been an interest in rare disease spaces for segmenting, but some pools of specialist HCPs could be as low as 30 to 50. You know, I hate to admit it in public, but I've done segmentations with sample sizes of 40 or 50 people. I've done this kind of analysis with segmentations of 40 or 50 people because about half of my business is B2B, and most of that is pharmaceutical. And so it's not uncommon. It's frustrating sometimes, but not uncommon to have to work with segmentation studies with that small of samples. There's nothing in the math that won't allow you to do it. I mean, if that were a consumer study, we'd be horrified. What if the people we're talking to are 45 weirdos that don't represent the market? But when 45 is all you can get, you have to live with it. And the nice thing is, this works. Have I ever tried using ElasticNet or Lasso for variable selection? The answer is no, I have not. I've had people recommend those to me, and to tell the truth, I really haven't had time. I just haven't had time to look into it. But the ElasticNet of the two, from what I can tell, looks like the more promising one to look at there. Okay, David asks, can you say a little bit more details on how to mix up the columns in unsupervised random forest? The truth is, you don't have to do anything. You run the unsupervised random forest, and it does the work for you. But what it does is it takes your actual data set. Let's say you've got 20 variables and an ID variable. It makes a copy of that, so a second set of 20 variables with an ID variable, stacks it under the first data set, and what it does is within each column of that copied data set, it randomizes the order of each variable separately, independently. So it breaks all the relationships, all the structural relationships that are in the data get broken in that copy. But again, you don't have to do this manually because the procedure does it for you. I just wanted to describe, I just think it's such a god-awful clever procedure that I wanted to give you some details about it. Because when I first learned about it, I had to think about it. Why do they call it unsupervised? It's not really unsupervised. That's confusing. How hard is this going to be to program? And then all you do is leave out a dependent variable. How easy is that? Anyway, cool method. I really like it.
He's wondering if there's also a white paper on this.
I don't have a white paper on this but it's all fully documented in the random forest package in R. So just look up the documentation for the random forest package. Okay, I thought this webinar would use Sawtooth software. Well, we could, right? We could use Sawtooth software has a cluster analysis program and a cluster ensembles program. I could have easily shown you that. But the truth is, although I talked about the latent class analysis that we ran, I didn't really show you that. So, and the variable selection stuff is all stuff we've done in R. But certainly if you use Sawtooth software's cluster analysis or cluster ensemble programs, you could do some of that variable selection there. You just can't do this predictive segmentation part. You really need to look at correlations for that. And our software doesn't do that. It's not what it does. It does cluster analysis, does conjoint analysis, doesn't really do much with correlations for you. Okay. Jeffrey Clark asks, what do you do if there's no obvious quasi-dependent variable? And I say in that case, you're just running an unsupervised segmentation. You don't need to worry about this predictive step. You would just do your regular variable selection and do a regular plain vanilla cluster or latent class analysis without a dependent variable. Okay, man asks, I was always taught to use factor analysis to reduce the number of basis variables, but I've heard it's a bad idea. Yeah, certainly the methods we talked about today are definitely preferred. Factor analysis, I was taught that in school too. Unfortunately, when I went to school, that was around about 1980 or thereabouts, I heard this. So it was actually on the verge of becoming an outdated bad practice even then. But textbooks sometimes take longer to catch up than practice does. And so it's really not a good idea. I think you'll find plenty of people who would pour plenty of hate on that idea. Okay, which solution do you prefer to run latent class clustering? Oh, I run latent class clustering either in R, where there's a nice program there called for model-based clustering called mclust. Very easy to use, very automated. If I want a little bit more control over it, like the mclust will automatically search for the optimal solution and only show you one unless you tell it you want to see more. A lot of times I like to have more control over what's happening, so I'll instead or also run latent class analysis in a piece of software called Latent Gold. Latent Gold will allow me to run an unsupervised segmentation, and it gives me all sorts of diagnostics. How did each of my variables perform by segment? Which ones are significant and which ones aren't? So if I want to do that variable selection process of dropping the non-significant ones, it makes it very easy to do. For that matter, the Sawtooth software cluster analysis and cluster ensemble programs also show you F statistics that allow you to do that variable selection. So, okay. Add factor analysis with non-orthogonal basis variables to discriminate. Again, factor analysis, maybe it does a good job identifying overlapping variables or correlated variables or redundant variables, and only picking the orthogonal ones to use. But again, you're likely to miss some important segmentation variables if you do that, because they might not be your marker variables, they might be the cross-loaded. Okay, Deborah asks, does the quasi-DV have to be ordinal or continuous? And the answer is no. It can be anything you want it to be. It could be entirely categorical. When you run the latent class, when you run the supervised random forest to find out which variables are predicting it, you just tell it if you're working with a categorical variable or not. You tell it if it's what R calls a factor. Factor is R's word for, hey, this is a categorical variable. So you could either run it with a categorical variable and tell it it's categorical, or don't tell it it's categorical, and it'll assume it's continuous. So, is it possible to do random forest in SPSS? Not in the version of SPSS I'm aware of. I know there are some commercial packages that do it very expensively, but R does it for you for free. So there's a bit of a learning curve to use R, but once you've climbed that curve, it's well worth doing. And I mean, I'd love it if there were easy to use software that did random forest. Justin's here, he's listening. Maybe we need to come up with a random forest product as Sawtooth software. That would be cool.
Hey, yeah, maybe.
I think we've exhausted questions.
There's one more question, Keith, that I answered poorly, probably. They were asking about how do you identify masking variables?
How do I identify masking variables? Masking variables would just be variables that aren't related to the cluster structure. So I talked about 3 different ways of identifying them. There's some automatic variable selection programs that will identify them, supposedly. Or at least one of them will. The clustbar cell will tell you which variables are masking variables and which ones aren't. Or you could do the you could do the thing where you cluster analyze your data, you look at the variables that aren't significant. Those are your masking variables, drop them from your analysis, prune them from your analysis, and rerun the analysis without them. That's another good way to identify them. And the third way is to use that unsupervised random forest. So we talk about 3 different ways of doing that. Ooh, have I run any segmentation solutions both with and without? Are there any cons you've seen to using a dependent variable? Well, it really depends here on what your objectives are, right? So if I want my segments to differ on some specific variable, if I ran it as an unsupervised segmentation, or a standard plain vanilla unsupervised segmentation, I might have a lucky day. And when I have a lucky day, I would see interesting differences on that variable across my segments. But if I wasn't having a lucky day, and my days tend not to be that lucky, actually, if I wasn't having a lucky day, I wouldn't see that. And I would kick myself and say, Keith, why did you run an unsupervised segmentation? You should have run a predictive segmentation. That would have pretty much guaranteed that we were seeing some differences on that variable of interest. So that's really the only con, is how much luck it requires you to have. And are you feeling lucky today?
Thank you so much, Keith, and Dan, thank you as well. Thanks everyone for coming. We will send this recording out to all those who registered, and Keith's also allowed us to share his slides. So we'll do both of those. Keith and Dan, right, work on our consulting team. If you guys need any help with your projects, feel free to reach out to him, and he can advise you. With that, thanks again, Keith, and thanks everyone. We will talk to you later.